Welcome to the Great Humbling Podcast. I'm Dougal Tyne, and since 2020 I've been recording these conversations with my friend Ed Gillespie. We start where our work meets and the places it takes us, the things that we're reading, the things that are getting us thinking, circling around the thought that these times in which we're living might be a humbling, a time of being brought down to earth and changed by the impact. Thank you for listening. Ed, it's Friday afternoon. It's been too long. It's been too long since we've been humbled. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's been since April. I don't quite know how those months have flown by. And I did wonder whether we were suffering some kind of PTSD following the Sean Connery Mankini discussions. I mean, it's enough to sort of traumatize anyone. So maybe it's been a welcome break in order to
Oh.
regather ourselves.
Yeah, we'll have to trace all of the consequences that are downstream from Zardoz. Well, gosh, I mean, what sort of state does this autumn find you in, sir?
Oh, these are very big questions, Dougal. Well, I mean, I I wrote something recently about bystander leadership. Like, how do you get people not to be bystanders? And how do you find the leadership that breaks ranks, that actually steps out into risky and problematic and potentially quite vulnerable territory? So I think I'm feeling a bit like that this autumn. Um, I'm feeling like with the world as it is, and with all of those interconnected shit shows, as they refer to them at Hard Art, it means that leadership is more important than ever. Although what style that leadership takes is a good question. But yeah, I think this idea of bystander leadership, that the ability to step out and break rank, um, without using a military metaphor, obviously, it is really important. And then if others step in behind you, then it can be really effective. But if you're then left standing alone in the newly broken ground, then it can be a bit scary, I guess. So that's
Mhm.
kind of what I'm reflecting on at the moment.
All right. Yeah. The thing that was coming to mind for me was a discussion that we had a year or so ago, almost a year ago, in the last online series that I taught with a school called Home, because that's sort of on hold at the moment, the online series, because I'm in the depths of writing, which no doubt will come up at some point in this episode. But as things fell out, we began the 5 week series last autumn, the day that the US election results had come out. And one of the discussions that I remember having with some of the North American participants was about witnessing and the idea of being a witness. And we realized that it's a double-edged thing because for some people, the connotation of being a witness is absolutely being a bystander. Whereas there is also this active, powerful,
Mm,
radical sense of bearing witness and of refusing to look away,
yeah,
changing what is going on in a situation by the way that you choose to place your attention and the way that you choose to tell what you are seeing. So maybe there's something in that that's also helpful to thinking.
attention is an intervention.
Mm,
I think is fair to say, even if it feels like a passive one.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, what else have you been up to in all of these months? Because it's not like we've been kind of chatting away in the
No,
either. And we have been trying to get together and record one of these for about a month. But I'm really curious what's been going on in Gillespie world.
oh, I've done a few things. I mean, I spent a lot of time with Sam Lee, the folk singer, not necessarily entirely by design, but I went singing with nightingales twice in the spring, which was really lovely in May. And it reminded me of just how harmoniously beautiful those experiences are when you're in the woods in the dead of night with a large group of people all sat in sort of reverential silence, listening to these incredible musicians playing along with the Nightingales, and this sort of duet between human and the more than human world, and it's so soul enriching. And we had this incredible moment as we were walking into the woods at night, in single file, in silence, no light. So very much by the moonlight, feeling your way. And you could hear this little noise, like, do you know what it was? It was caterpillars in all of the trees, these
Oh,
moth caterpillars eating the very first shoots of the new spring leaves, but it was audible.
yes.
There were so many millions and billions of them. You could actually hear them noshing. And then coming down in a sort of light rain was what they called frass, which is either like let's just call it the excreta,
Yes.
um, or it's bits of chewed up leaf that are falling out. But there's a fine green covering on everything as a result of this massive noshing that's going on of the canopy.
Has it been an epic butterfly year in England?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it has been here as well. Do you know anything about the biology of that, about what's been going on? Is that anything that you've been
I think it's something to do with the very mild spring and the very mild weather, and it was a very mild winter, which also
Yeah.
helps. Um, I don't know anything other than that. I mean, it was fascinating what I did there, um, to experience that, because I'd done singing with nightingales several times, but it was the first time I'd actually heard the caterpillars eating and felt and seen the frass coming down from the trees.
Singing with nightingales with caterpillars on percussion.
Kind
Reminds
of.
me of walking along the harbour wall at Anstruther in the East Nook of Fife, where I spent a summer in the late 90s on my own, failing to write a book because I was far too young. And one of my memories of that summer is walking along the harbour wall at night at low tide and hearing this kind of glistening sound.
Mm,
And it was the barnacles on the outside of the harbour wall at low tide, and the little twinkling glistening of thousands of barnacles. It's the same kind of
that's amazing.
micro sound. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you have to be very quiet to be able
Yeah.
to pick up on that kind of stuff. It's really beautiful. Um, and then I did something I hadn't done for 35 years, which is I went on a Norfolk Broads holiday. I'm a Norfolk boy,
Oh,
born and bred.
yeah.
And being back here, I hired a old wooden boat with some friends, and actually had an absolutely magical time doing that. And the Broads in that like midsummer heat were like the Everglades, these like limpid pools of lilies and endless reeds whispering in the wind. And uh, I'd forgotten how wonderful it can be, and sort of kicked myself with why have I left that 3.5 decades before I've gone back to doing, the touristy thing. But actually, it was really wonderful. And then last month, I've just been off on the writing retreat in Lambay again, the Lambay Island writing retreat that I co-host every year in September, which again is like this island full of wallabies off the coast of Ireland, which is very surreal.
Wow.
You go to the wallabies were released there in the 50s, and now there's like 400 of them. So you're in this classic Celtic island context, and then every now and again an Antipodean marsupial goes doinging past, and you're like, well, that's out of context.
Okay. Yeah. Was it fruitful for you, the retreat? Did you get a lot of writing done?
It was actually. I was reflecting again on a piece I wrote there a couple of years ago, which seems ever more apposite, and it sort of plays to what we were just saying about bystanders and bearing witness. But Lambay was the site of a very famous shipwreck. It was known as the first Titanic, the HMS Taylor, or the RMS Taylor, which was a ship that was the first ironclad sailing ship, built for the Australian gold rush, taking passengers from Liverpool over to the Antipodes. And it was a rush job. It was built under commercial pressure. They'd made all sorts of mistakes in the design. The rigging was poor. They hadn't stretched the ropes. I think half the sailors were Chinese who didn't speak English. I mean, it was a kind of catalogue of mistakes. There weren't enough lifeboats, as there weren't with the actual Titanic. But the most crucial thing was they didn't rebalance, or they weren't aware that they had to rebalance the ship's compasses for the iron hull.
Oh, yeah.
So the compasses were distorted by the iron hull, which meant that the captain thought they were sailing south and they were actually sailing west. And
It's
then
sort of
they,
like the original GPS
yeah,
disaster
and they
when,
ran aground.
yeah.
They basically crashed into the island of Lambay, and half the people on board drowned. And so I've been reflecting a lot on about what the institutions in which we operate, or the institution in which people operate, to what extent they are also distorting our personal moral compasses,
Mm,
and how awkward and uncomfortable and painful that can feel when
mm,
your own moral compass feels like it's pointing in a very different direction.
mm. Yeah. Wow. Well, gosh, so I'm trying to think back over the months, what have I been up to? I there is a kind of state of being that being fairly deep in writing brings with, I mean, Anna could tell you about this because I think it's the family that it lands hardest on. But I'm definitely kind of I only half here and half sort of in the swirl of the stuff that I'm thinking
Yeah.
about and reading about and writing about at the moment, trying to I guess my writing often tends to be like this, that it's things I've been thinking about and talking about and carrying around for years. And at the point where I'm trying to write at length, it's really a work of sort of putting that down in a form that I can both sort of stand by and let go, like let that travel outwards, which means going back and, you know, checking things, reading more carefully into things, often learning new bits that were missing from the story as I had heard it and been carrying it that allow it to be told in a fuller way. But so I'm in the middle of all of that, and just I mean this week in the middle of thinking about this massive, strange word, culture, which I just learned from Terry Eagleton's book of the same name. I think it's just called Culture. But he's referencing somebody else, Raymond Williams, saying culture is I think the fourth most complex word in the English language. It certainly feels that way, trying to tell a story around the history and meanings and journey of that word, because the story I'm really trying to tell in this new book is uh, the deep roots of the trouble we're in lie in culture.
Mm.
We, you know, if I wanted to be provocative, I'd say we don't have a climate crisis, we have a culture crisis. And one of the symptoms of it is this thing that we call climate change. Or perhaps more helpfully, ecological breakdown and cultural breakdown are two sides of the same process, but the ecological is the outside. The cultural is the inside, and it actually starts from within. So that's what we need to attend to. And as soon as I'm telling you that, you can hear that this is stuff that I've been talking about and writing about in one way or another for years. But it's time to get this written. Hopefully, then get it out in the world. I have not yet actually got a definite plan for how this new book is going to end up being published. So there are things in the air, but if there's any if there are any great humbling listeners who are agents or work in publishing and want to talk to me about it, then now would be a good time to reach out. I'm open for those conversations, but I I know that one way or another the book will find its way into the world. I'm not terribly worried about that, and I'm just at the stage of needing to get on with the writing of it. So that's, especially since August, that's been really where I've been at. Before that, well, Anna and Alfie and I went to Italy, took the train to Italy, which was wonderful, and spent 3 days hanging out in an Italian convent with a bunch of Illich's old friends and other people who are part of the sort of the conversation that grows out of Illich's work. So that was one of the high points of
Amazing.
the year so far. Yeah. And then I suppose the other thing was it was the summer of celebrating elders. We celebrated my parents' 50th wedding anniversary
Wow.
in England. Me and Alfie went after we'd been in Italy. We did a detour to England for a week and we were there. And me and my sister organized a party for their anniversary. And then we came back and we had this big, glorious party for Anna's mum's 80th birthday party. And it was one of those times when I really experienced two things. One is part of what I love about Anna and her whole family is that they carry a lot of skill and practice of hospitality and conviviality. And Anna's mum has been somebody who has been the one throwing the party, holding the space every Friday afternoon in their bungalow on their little street in a small Swedish town called Sigtuna. She'd throw up the window and shout, "The bar is open" at 5 o'clock, and around, and all the husbands would be standing outside smoking because she wouldn't let them smoke in the house. And
Of course not.
so, yeah, quite. But there's for somebody like that to then, to be part of the heart of the crew that throws them a party where she said, this is going to be the last big party. I'm turning 80. Do do me one big party while I'm still around. And it was marvelous. And also the ways in which relationships deepen, the things that last
Hmm.
out of the work of doing a really good celebration. I felt that very strongly this summer. So that's
Well,
my
exactly. If you do
gratitude.
the big decade parties, then you don't get many of them in a lifetime, do you?
No, no, you don't.
So
Exactly.
having done my 50th, it's like going,
I
well,
know.
that means I've only got three left if I'm lucky. It might only be two
Who
or one.
knows? Yeah. Well, let's be grateful for them all.
Yeah.
Eh? Oh, right. What have you been reading, Ed?
What have I been reading? Always the question, isn't it? Well, I wanted to share a couple of things, or three things actually. So I've been reading. I read this one, which is uh, Brian Eno and Betty A's very little book, "What Art Does," because actually it plays to your culture point. About the complexity and the importance of culture and the kind of the problem of culture. And it's a really short book. I remember having a conversation with Brian about it, and he goes, "I'm trying to write it as short as possible, which is a real discipline." So it's basically a long essay, but all the better for it. And I think they talk about it as an unfinished theory. So they're not claiming to have completely nailed it, but they just sort of land on the essence of it. Art is a way of making feelings happen. And it's a really safe way for us to experiment with our emotions. It can help us kind of garner empathy for other people and other views and other beings. It can be about vision and looking towards possibilities of the imagination. And it's obviously about differences, how we can also explore things which are unalike. And it's playful. It's how children learn, and art is how, if play is how children learn, then art is how adults play. And there's a really great question he quotes from the trumpeter John Hassel, which is the question he says that we should all ask ourselves is, what is it that I really like? What is it that I really like? And to really like reflect and meditate on that, because that's often the answer for a lot of your creative musing. And yeah, so it's a really lovely book. It's about playing and feeling, dreams and communities, ideas and possibilities. And yeah,
Hmm.
I found it very inspiring.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I haven't read it yet, but even before you said you wanted to talk about it today, I've been thinking I really need to get my hands on it because I was revisiting this week Brian's essay from 1996, where he first set out this definition of culture that he's talked
Yeah.
about in lots of places, which I'm sure he revisits in the book, where he says, culture is everything we don't have to do. And I love it because it sounds like it's another version of the culture is a higher need that kicks in once all of our basic needs are met story, which is one of the things I'm taking to pieces in the book. But actually, you follow the example that the sort of you pull on the thread that he starts pulling on because his first example is food. He
Yeah.
says, you have to eat, but you don't have to eat cheeseburgers or kushari or palak paneer. But actually, once you start looking at it, it's really hard to find food without culture. If you look at if you look at that definition for a while, it's a little bit like a magic eye painting. You realize that what it's really directing your attention to is the necessity of the unnecessary, or the impossibility, apart from under very artificial, hard to construct conditions, of separating the necessary from the unnecessary,
Mm.
and what that tells us about the kind of world we're in and the kind of creatures we are. And the bit that I had forgotten is that he starts the 1996 version of that anyway by talking about Charles Darwin, which is really interesting because another book that I've been, a life's work really, that I've been working with in what I'm doing now is Ellen Dissanayake, whose books include Homo Aestheticus and I think it's called What is Art For? So it's almost the same title as
Yeah, yeah.
book. And she looks at art from the vantage point of evolutionary biology as a behavior.
Mm.
Says it's a universal behavior that, she says it has to have an adaptive purpose. And her definition of it is she says the behavior is the behavior of making special. The thing
Mm.
humans do that builds on and takes further the ritual behaviors that we see among other animals, the aesthetic sensibility actually that we see among other animals. But the thing that humans do, we're really good at taking something from one context and lifting it, using words in a way, using images in a way, using gestures in a way, using sound in a way that takes it outside of its ordinary. And in so doing, reveals or creates extraordinary layers of reality.
Mm.
And where I would go with that is that that's how we make worlds. Humans, this is again, I'm sort of spilling the beans on what I'm writing about, but we've talked loads over the years in climate conversations about the uninhabitable Earth, as David Wallace Wells famously framed it as this threat looming down later in the century. And what I realized over the last few years is that there are loads of people around us already experiencing the absence of a habitable world.
Mm.
Because the first symptom of cultural breakdown is that we lose the skill, the practice, the coherence of making worlds together. And we try and live in the absence of that, which becomes immensely costly and creates the
Mm.
uninhabitable Earth problem. But it starts with the absence of the habitable world. I'm gonna stop talking because otherwise I'm just gonna spill the beans on the whole
He's going to
without
try and
having done
keep
the hard
whittling
work
it
of
under your hat. Yes.
writing.
Well, no, I mean, and it's well, I mean, actually, I'm building on that. So the second book I wanted to mention was Robert
Ooh, yeah.
Macfarlane's, Is a River Alive? Because, I mean, he talks about that. The book is essentially the the story of three rivers or three different river systems. Like one is the Los Cedros cloud forest in Ecuador. The last one is I'm going to pronounce this really badly. The Mutahekau Shipu, which is the Magpie River in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. But the middle one and the middle section of the book actually plays exactly to your point about people living in an uninhabitable place. It was about the rivers of Chennai in East India, and the kind of are those rivers actually still alive? They're so degraded and polluted, and yet people still living, alongside them, or large numbers of people still living alongside them. But it's an incredible book about the magic and the spirit of those places, and whether he's talking about the Ecuadorian work that's been done around the law surrounding those rivers, because for now, at least, the Los Cedros cloud forest is being protected and has been recognized for its importance. As I say, the rivers of Chennai are in a really sorry state, and then the Mutahekau Shipu in Canada is just like this absolute force of nature, unconquerable, indomitable, incredible. It's sort of mind blowing when he describes the effect on the landscape of this river, which is just incredible. And that's been facing challenges with hydroelectric and dams and all those kind of things. So it's an incredible book, but I wanted to read one quote from the end, which is actually not from Robert Macfarlane. It's
Mm.
actually from another writer, Alexis Wright, who talks about, well, the quote speaks for itself, but she says, the world desperately needs powerful storytellers to help us make sense of the unfathomable events taking place. And while sitting in eternity, the very old ones will be impressing in these future writers a way of figuring out how to bring life back into the laws of the creative beings in the sand desert and the seas, how to bring life back into the waters, the mountains and skies, the flatlands and plains, back into the bushlands, the forests, the thunder and winds, back into the trees and animals. And I think that speaks a little to what you're describing. It's like, yeah, how do we make sense of the stories that reconnect us back into this, you know, interdependency and interconnectedness that we feel that we've obviously lost.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've heard me talk for years about regrowing a living culture
Yeah,
and that sense that coming alive, that recognizing the sort of lifelessness or the morbid, damaged quality of even the kind of materially very um remarkable ways of living that we have, and the journey onwards, the journey through and beyond the trouble that we're in is going to have to be a journey of coming alive. That's what I hear in
yeah,
those lines. Yeah.
absolutely. And then I'm indulging myself by having three books, and then the third one is your friend and mine, Jay
Yeah.
Griffiths, How Animals Heal Us, which, oh my God, what a book! What a book!
Oh,
I don't know if you've read it yet, but
I haven't. No.
no, I mean, it's classically brilliant, Jay. She breaks it down into like how they heal the individual psyche, the individual body, our physicality, but also the body politic and the soul politic. So it's written in sort of four sections, but it's just full of the most fantastic stories. So the individual psyche is obviously all about, the way that animals are so good for, and pets in particular, for loneliness and
Mm.
well-being and happiness and their playfulness. She tells this wonderful story about how crows play king of the castle, and it's
Mm.
quite possible that, our ancestors learned how to play King of the Castle by watching the crows. The crows were
Really?
probably doing it long before we were, and watching them and going, "That looks like quite a fun game."
Oh,
um,
well, I have one that kind of matches on to that then. This Jean Giono, he's French novelist. He wrote this novel. It came out, I think, in 1935. The English title is Joy of Man's Desiring, which sort of brings a him into the picture that isn't there in the original French name of it. But I started reading this because Jack Barron, who I suspect is a listener of this podcast, told me he was reading this book and it was as though John Berger and Ivan Illich had got together and written a novel. And I was sold. And it really is. I'm halfway through it. It's as marvelous as that suggests. But one of the things that Janot is extraordinary at is just the way that he moves between the human and the animal characters in this on this plateau where this story is playing out in early 20th century France. And apparently he wrote a trilogy of novels that are kind of woven around Pan, which I know is going to be up your street. So
definitely.
we'll have to see what else by Janot is available in English. But this one, Joy of Man's Desiring, I can definitely recommend.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, and connected to that. So the other thing I wanted to mention about Jay's book is,
Yeah.
and what you were saying earlier about art and aesthetic sensibility. There's a lovely story about there's film footage of a chimpanzee basically dancing in joy at the vista of a waterfall.
Yes.
Literally almost like, ah, this waterfall is so amazing. I am gonna dance in front of it. It's like, so there's wonderful stuff in the book, and she's just managed to collate these incredible examples and stories, which are both entertaining educational and wholly edifying.
Mm,
And I
wonderful.
was going to talk about Luke Kemp, Goliath's Curse, but I think we definitely need to save that for another time.
Yeah, let's save that one. I haven't read that yet, but that's been on my radar. So, other things on the agenda, Ed. I sent you a message, and it already feels like we're slightly further on in the story now. But when the results of the Green Party leadership election came out, I sent you a message. I said, "Did we break the Green Party, Ed?" Because there is, at least at that sort of moment when the results came out, there's a take where you can go, totally understand how this has happened, but how does a party that has been, succeeding by winning seats off the Tories in rural England, elect an avowedly left-wing populist leader? How is this really gonna go well? And there is a sort of chain of causality. I don't want to claim too much for it, but there is one of the threads that can be traced back to this sort of the Zach moment, let's say, goes back to an episode of this podcast that we did about 18
Mm,
months ago, which started with me making the proposition of, let's make populism good again. So,
yeah.
making populism green again. Ed, how's it going? You're closer to these things than I am.
Well, yeah. I mean, so we did that podcast together, didn't we? Where we were talking about make populism good. Which wasn't much of a stretch of the imagination to make populism green. And then we had a bit of a kind of post UK general election analysis here at the Mill with some of the great and good. So, Jonathan Porritt, Caroline Lucas, Rupert Reed, and Adrian Ramsey. And we all came together and we were having a discussion about, well, what does the Green Party do next? Um, and one of the threads was obviously tackling the rise of reform. And I mentioned the podcast and I said, well, Dougal and I had a really interesting conversation about this, and we actually recorded a podcast where we talked about how do you make populism good? I mean, is populism inherently bad or is it just the way that it's generally practiced? Anyway, so we came up with this idea of green popularism, which I actually went back to the document we wrote, which describes a new overarching focus seeking a form of populism that is not polarizing and that is not based only out of anger, but that boldly challenges the other rising force in British politics and sets out an alternative stall, reality based and clear. So it's civic, it's civil, it's depolarizing, and also about returning civility to our public discourse, which in itself might be popular. Um, and
Yeah.
we briefed it in to some senior members of the Green Party, including Mr. Polanski.
And
Um,
I remember seeing Caroline wrote a piece for the New Statesman last
yeah,
autumn that was on the need for climate populism. And I definitely saw Rupert talking about this as well. So it's been a conversation that's sort of been bubbling away. Uh,
exactly.
yeah, there's a slight sense of, gosh, responsibility when you then see that translate into the direction that the party is taking. Though doubtless there are many other things that have fed into that, not least the
Yeah.
decisions of everyone who voted in the leadership election. But what's your sense now, like a few weeks in, of how it's unfolding and what's your read on?
My read, I mean, as I say, we can't claim all the kind of lines of causality, but I certainly think Zach does feel like a very different dynamic force in
Mm,
politics. I think he had an excellent time on Question Time in the last week or so. He's pretty erudite.
mm,
He's been very direct. He's been particularly good around recent events, in the UK, being from Manchester and being Jewish,
mm,
and being able to hold this horrible false binary that the media were trying to, and the government actually, to be fair, were trying to
mm,
make around, you can't grieve the Manchester synagogue attack and the genocide in Gaza at the same time. You've got to pick a side, which, Zach's been really, really emphatic about. So, well, that's absolute nonsense. If you believe in, a plural set of ideas and a pluralistic notion of humanity, then of course you can grieve both of those things and be equally horrified and saddened by them equally.
I'm glad to hear what you're saying. Is I haven't seen the Question Time appearance, but what was coming to me as you were saying that was it actually took me back to the episode we did on George Monbiot,
Yeah.
because one of the things I remember saying in that is, you know, part of the part of the difficulty of the sort of hard eco-modernist turn, or sort of disaster eco-modernist turn that George has taken, is that he has been so important for the
Mm.
environmental movement in the UK because the media landscape, the space of public discourse in the UK is so brutal that to have someone who can kind of really play as a heavyweight kind of public pugilist in the public debate and stand up to the tone of Today program interviewers and so on was such an asset. And the difficulty being then when George kind of turns his fire on others who don't have that particular set of public school debating techniques up their sleeve
Yeah.
within the environmental movement. But I mean, one of the things that it's early days, but one of the things that sounds really promising in how Zach is showing up is just, you know, having somebody who's got the energy and the moves to not just be made to look like a wimp in
Yeah.
the ugliness of British public debate. I was really struck by Mary Harrington, who I don't imagine is a Green voter, um, wrote yesterday. I mean, I find Mary's writing endlessly interesting, and she's been writing a lot about the deep implications of the media transformation from a world of print literacy to a world of digital literacy. And Mary was thinking about this stuff 20 years ago when we used to hang out together. And she was in her latest piece, she was talking about the type of politician that thrives in the new totally online environment. And she said there's a kind of quality, a sort of star quality, that just sort of effortlessly generates memes that is a new and it's different to the form of political charisma that worked in the TV era. And she said, you know, the first big examples of it that we had were on the right, and therefore it's easy to assume that it's just a thing on the right. And
Mm.
you know, Trump and Boris Johnson being in their different ways examples of that. But she said, I think we're starting to see what the left version of that looks like. And she named two people. She named Mamdani, who's running for mayor of New York, and she named Zach.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting. And then I saw the poll that was going around today, where, I mean, goodness knows what the state of the parties in the UK can translate into once you get closer to an election. But with the Greens on sort of 15%, only a point or two behind Labour and the Tories. And you do just get that thing of, well, you know, if reform can flip
Mm.
the vote, you know, can two parties do that within the same parliamentary term? Are things sufficiently weird and broken at that? Maybe the next general election turns out to be a battle between Reform and the Greens. That would be a state of affairs which would have been hard to foresee, you know, not that long ago, and that begins to just kind of glimmer over the edge of the horizon of possibility, a little bit like that moment when Corbyn sort of started to take the lead
Mm.
in the Labour leadership election back in 2015. So and you know, you know me, I'm not terribly optimistic about these things, and I don't tend to invest terribly much of my energy in kind of
Mm.
existing political systems. But nonetheless, I'm curious about it.
I mean, it's certainly very febrile times, you know, incredibly volatile and unpredictable. And I think, you know, we stood on that beach in Dunwich, didn't we, in Suffolk on
Yeah,
election night, with Charlotte Ducan, looking at the sunset and not knowing how that election was going to unfold at that point. But I think, you know, it's safe to say it's been a very difficult 15 months. I mean, the thing that's really been exercising me, um, is this, certainly as a kind of, an activist and someone who's been involved in a lot of protest, is the Palestine Action prescription, where we have a government that's been complicit in genocide in Gaza, whilst turning the protesters against that into terrorists. And it's really hard to sort of comprehend the sort of mind-bending trickery and on authoritarianism that has led to this sort of sorry state of affairs. But I
Yeah.
mean, it is like a theater of the absurd. You really can't make it up. You've had people arrested for wearing, t-shirts which say, "I support plasticine action," because the police officers can't tell the difference between plasticine action and and Palestine action. You've had people arrested for holding private eye cartoons. And I don't know if you saw this last week, like the New World magazine actually printed one of the banners on the front page, which said, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action." And a guy bought a copy at King's Cross Station, walked through the station holding it up, and a police officer arrested him. So a news magazine, which is sold
Yeah.
at 10,000 outlets across the UK, has caused this guy to be arrested and potentially facing terrorism charges. I mean, it's so mad. I mean,
It's
and they
just broken.
described it in the New World as the dumbest law of our times. And it's just like it's the epitome of idiotic, ill thought through policy making and these huge bear trap mistakes that this current government just seems to be all too gleefully happy to make and then double down on.
Yeah. No, I mean it's just broken. And I mean I think this was sort of my next heading for us really in things worth talking about is where are we at in the timeline? What time is it?
Yeah,
And I guess I probably that's a way of framing things that I picked up mainly from Gordon White. That is sort of I find it helpful in that one of the challenges, and again, Mary Harrington was writing about this recently, one of the challenges in navigating the kind of online environment, the kind of activist environment, the kind of even online environment is an anachronistic phrase now, the kind of environment the kind of human environment we're living in now that is fully permeated by these media is the latest thing and the sort of maxing your outrage, your emotional investment, whatever it is, in the latest thing. And the answer to that can't be a sort of detachment or quietism or whatever, but there is some kind of practice of being aware of what is going on and also not allowing your nervous system to be regulated by the collective voice of what everyone is talking about on social media today.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so one way of being with that again, Gordon's the person who I think got me oriented to this, is just this thing of going, okay, there are processes that are unfolding that could have been averted 20 years ago, but you're not at the point in the timeline where it's possible to do the averting, and therefore a kind of just sober awareness of where we are in the timeline of things that are unfolding that you can do little about, but that you can nonetheless make your decisions both individually and with those you are working with in whatever capacity in relation to. I mean, it's not so far away from that Taoist thing that I got from Alistair McIntosh, the sort of application of the Wu Wei principle, which says if you try and do it under your own energy, you'll get flattened by forces that don't even notice you. What you
yeah, yeah,
do is become very aware of the energies that are moving and the inflection points, the places where it is possible to do something that tilts something in another direction. But the example that's been with me of where we're at in the timeline is there is a redirection of resources by European governments towards rearmament and militarization and all of it in the light of Ukraine, in the light of the sense of Trump not being, America not being a reliable ally and so on. And you know, generally speaking, I have very little to say about questions of defense and military strategy. But what I notice is the way that this is showing up, and I noticed two examples within a couple of days. One was Anna pointed out to me a think tank report from a think tank associated with the right-wing government here in Sweden, proposing that the what's it called? It's like the National Inheritance Fund, basically. It's a major source of funding for local civil society voluntary actors, which basically when someone dies and they haven't left a will and there isn't an automatic heir, then their their assets go to this fund and then it gets given away in what can be quite generous grants to voluntary local
Yeah.
associations that make a real difference. And so this think tank is proposing that in the next parliamentary term, that should all go in, that should be dissolved, and in future, those resources should go to civil defense funding instead. And then the next day, I was talking to an academic in the Netherlands who just said matter of factly, oh, yeah, like the entire research budget of my university has been given to the military. So basically, the only research now is research that the military wants done. And I thought, I bet there are 100 other examples of that going on around Europe right now that aren't on my radar. But the other bit of it is how little difference any of this is going to make. And here there's a guy who writes under the name Aurelian, and
Mm.
he's clearly uh, of a generation where he was at university in the 60s, so he's retired now. He's clearly worked at places including NATO in the course of his career, not at the highest level, but he has experience inside international institutions around defense, amongst other things. And he writes a weekly essay on Substack called uh, How to Understand, Trying to Understand the World. That's the name of his Substack. And it was in
Oh,
one of
cool.
those recently, and he's hit this theme a few times where he was just like, money is the least of the problems. European decision makers are now discovering that the world is not a gigantic Amazon store from which you can order anything you like. Only marginal improvements can be expected in European capabilities, and the US will never again be able to deploy more than a token military capability in Europe itself. So it's on the one hand the sense that resources are being redirected
Mm.
away from other places into armament and militarization. And on the other hand, the sense that it won't even work because you can't just replace with money decades of institutional decay. And it's not only the military side of things where that
Mm.
is true for the kind of world that we're in now. That's part of the more general
And
broken.
and just to throw another angle into that, which makes it slightly even more bleaker. But I was just having a conversation with someone this morning, in the military, who suggested to me that even if there was a ceasefire in Ukraine, and some kind of peace settlement, agreed there, that the Russian economy has now been put on such a kind of war footing, and has been so integrated into being a war machine that it would almost be obliged to become active in another theatre and another sphere, in order to justify its continuance. So you either have to remove Putin, or you end up with the machine having to be directed elsewhere, because that's
But
the only thing
this
it can
is,
do.
I'm going to sound a bit cross here. I had this conversation with my father-in-law the other day. I was like, but why do you think removing Putin fixes anything? That's
No, exactly.
a
Yeah,
Western fantasy
yeah.
that this is because of one mad, evil man. No, I mean, I don't. The idea that you get rid of Putin and it works as a sort of color revolution that replaces him with some nice Western friendly. We don't even have leaders like that in America anymore. I mean, how many European countries are we going to have leaders like that in? And you expect that assassinating Putin is somehow miraculous? Sorry, I know that's not what you were saying, Ed, but that sounds like a lot of what people are wishing for when they talk as if getting rid of Putin fixes anything.
Mm.
I,
Yeah, I mean, it's the political leadership equivalent of your wishing on space hardware.
Yeah, something like that, isn't it? Yeah. Well, okay. Let's move on to a more cheerful subject. My third bullet point in out of three for today. We had, where are we in the timeline, or what time is it? What time is love, Ed? What time is love?
It's 3 a.m. eternal, isn't it?
Well, it came to me because I got sent by friend of this podcast, Jay Springett, a piece called Hospicing Dance Music, which arrived in a very timely fashion in my inbox this morning, written by somebody called Xin or Sin, I don't know quite how it's pronounced, Xin, who's apparently significant in the sort of Berlin electronic music world. And this piece is them reading Hospicing Modernity and applying it to, the decaying and utterly unsustainable dance music industry world that they've spent their life in. And there are just some lines in this, and I just thought this whole idea of hospicing dance music, I figured you might have some thoughts on this, but just a few lines out of that piece. How can we imagine a music that is not danced to at the expense of others? If we do not look away from the reality that dance music as we know it cannot and will not be sustained, maybe we can find a provocation to start moving towards and cultivating other dance musics. Can we hospice dance music as one cell, one extremity of its music or culture industry limb, of modernity at large? Can it be a space for practicing? And then at the end, if it sounds romantic, it's because it is. What else would I want my relationship to music to be?
I love it. I love it. I mean, that has got to be one of the more original takes on hospicing modernity, hasn't it?
Well, one of the things I'm really appreciating is seeing the way in which seeing what happens when people take the ideas from hospicing modernity or from at work in the ruins and take them into the context where they've spent their lives, contexts they know really well that me and Vanessa and others don't necessarily know anything about. And I mean, I felt the same thing when I read Liz Oldfield did a wonderful interview with Iona Lawrence from the Decelerator, which we've spoken about before on this podcast. And again, I find something really rewarding about people coming back with what they're learning, attempting to apply these ideas of the tasks for a time of endings, of hospicing and assisting with the birth to their fields of practice and fields of experience. There's something as well, that last bit about um, the romantic. I mean, I want to know more about this because this is another book that I know you've been reading that I haven't read. Love, Anger, and Betrayal. Jonathan Porritt has done this book with this
Yeah.
young generation of activists. I was really struck by love being part of the title of that because that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately. But yeah, tell me more about that book.
I mean, it's a very powerful book. I mean, it's one of those books where you think you don't need to read it because you think you know it all. But really, the love and the betrayal, and the book is based on Jonathan's interviews and working alongside about 20 different Just Stop Oil activists and
Mm.
protesters. Many of whom have served prison sentences for their actions. And the love and betrayal is really the love of their motivation and the way that the system has absolutely betrayed them through its kind of brutal punishment and crackdown on them. And the anger is actually all Jonathan's.
Mhm.
He's quite honest about that. He's saying, like, the fury is mine. And he's very self-deprecating in his very grizzled, old way. And I think at one point, and he was a mentor of mine, and we're still good friends. But he said, their actions and where we find ourselves now just makes, in hindsight, my so-called theory of change demonstrably fucked. I think were the exact words he used. Um, and it's a very beautiful intergenerational book
Yeah,
of someone who's spent their whole life as a campaigner of some way, shape, or form. I mean, Jonathan's been at this for half a century,
absolutely.
but then the moral clarity and the absolute, cut through of the eloquent articulation that you get from the JSO gang is
Mm,
really moving. It's really quite beautiful. I mean, there's a quote from Ella Ward, one of the activists, who said it all comes down to what people see as a responsible or sane response to what is happening in the world. For me, what we're doing with Just Stop Oil is the most logical, sane thing to be doing. What is completely insane is pretending that we can keep on living normally with our crazy consumption driven lifestyles, even as the climate scientists keep on telling us that we're crashing through one threshold after another. Now, we know that. We see this like time and again from these different protesters. They're very good at articulating this position because it does feel like madness, and many of them are facing ever increasing sentences, or even the threat potentially of being labeled as terrorists. We joke darkly about eco-terrorism, but the state is now cracking down on them and trying to label them as terrorists. And I mean, as a counterpoint to that, the other quote I wanted to share was, climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals. But the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. Now, that's not a JSO protester, that's Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. And so, Jonathan's book is a brilliant encapsulation of this very sharp way that the activists have of expressing their positions and the rationale for why they did what they did, alongside the sort of quite humbling and quietly furious anger of a very grizzled veteran campaigner, and it
yeah.
makes for a really great mix and a very compelling read.
Yeah. I, that thing of just naming the madness,
Yeah,
and naming the experience of the cognitive dissonance of the kind of going mad. I mean, that's there as well in that hospicing dance music piece. That's
yeah,
one of the things that they write about as well. And I mean, I was struck by that, by love being in that title. I was struck by that final bit from the dance music piece of, if it sounds romantic, it's because it is.
yeah.
I've always, like, from very early on in Dark Mountain, I've always been very resistant to embracing romanticism, and even with like folks like Martin Shaw, who um romanticism as activism has been one of Martin's catchwords for a long time. And if anyone has the right to claim it, then he does. But I finally kind of thawed a bit on this, partly because, well, I mean, our last episode was the Zardoz one. I've been in touch some more over the summer with Anthony Galuzzo, and he and some friends who, they're all younger than us. They're based in New York. They've launched this journal called Romanticon for a revival of romantic letters. And I wrote the sort of inaugural essay when they launched it last month, which was a reconsideration of, um, you know, my own attitude towards this language of romanticism, I suppose. And it's an interesting conversation that's going on around that, because it can so easily seem like, and it risks falling into a kind of fiddling while Rome burns. And yet there's a thread within it. And Justin Smith Ryu of the Internet, who's also written for Romanticon, has been articulating this in a way that I really appreciate. That, actually love might be, like, reclaiming love politically might be very important at this point in the
Mm,
timeline.
mm,
This bit was from Justin's latest essay on the Internet earlier this week, which was called How to Change the World for Real. And there's a bit in that where he says, for a brief period in the previous century, with a sharp terminus antiquo of 1969, love was elevated to a mainstream political ideal, however hypocritical some of those who learned to invoke it may have been. It was invoked constantly by Martin Luther King, and it was invoked by Robert Kennedy in his eulogy to MLK. Hannah Arendt characterized amor mundi, love of the world,
mm.
as an absolute precondition for any hope of improvement of our shared realm. And that goes back to this thing that I'm talking about culture as the skill of making worlds together and the loss of that skill. James Baldwin insisted that the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others. And I'm really, you know, I'm really drawn to what happens when we put together the kind of the acknowledging and the living out, the acting from the madness and the naming of love in the center of that, that's there in what you're talking about from the book that Jonathan's done with the JSO activists, and that's there in this conversation that I've been part of with the Romanticon world. And another another bit that sort of fits into that that came to me today from the latest essay from David Bentley Hart, who is this fiercely erudite, brilliant, sometimes rather personally fierce. I don't think he even calls himself a theologian. I mean, I've seen him presented as a theologian. I've seen him presented as a philosopher. Um, but who also posts the best dog and baby videos and has written a couple of books which he clearly counts very high among his output that are sort of dialogues with his late dog. So there's a nice connection there across to Jay's book. But
Oh, that sounds a bit worrying, like the like Argentinian leader, Milei, like I
oh,
think,
right.
yeah, he takes policy advice from his dogs. But anyway, that's a
I
different conversation.
see. Okay, I don't. I'm not sure David Bentley Hart takes or gives policy advice, but this essay, the genealogy of genealogy, it's pretty high-powered philosophy theory stuff, but it culminates in this wonderful passage. He says there are real. He's talking about this kind of suspicion. Like the whole essay is about suspicion as this kind of privileged thing within lots of the intellectual tradition of the past 2 centuries in the West. And the last example he lands on is the suspicion of gift. He says there are real gifts, and they become more real the more they are given in the hope of gratitude, even if that gratitude must not be regarded as a price to be exacted. Rather, recognition and delight, gratuity and thankfulness are the currency of love, which is refined and deepened the more the love of self opens out into the love of others and grants those others the dignity of persons whose thanks is infinitely precious. Thus, in giving a gift in the hope of opening the way to real communion, one learns to receive oneself back again, now as the gift that only the other can give. Here we see that it is suspicion that itself can become the mask of the true deep structure of reality, the surface layer of the palimpsest that must be scraped away until the truth is really revealed. Love, which is at once more original than the will to power and stronger than death. And as I was reading that and, grappling with the philosophical end of what he was doing that brought him to that conclusion, I thought it's such a parallel for me to that story that Adam Wilson from the Peasantry School tells about that young father who comes to one of the gratitude feasts at Sand River Community Farm. And at the end of the afternoon comes up to Adam and says, I didn't think things like this actually existed anymore. And Adam says to him, so what is it you're noticing? And the young man says, well, it's like you all have created an irony-free zone. And that to me is like the absence of the experience of a habitable world is that for so many people, they've never experienced an irony-free zone, a space in which people are taking the risk of acting lovingly in the way that David Bentley Hart is describing there. And there's something in that that I think is tough and powerful and that I'm willing to stand for.
It makes me want to go right back to the John Hassel quote that Brian Eno was referencing. What is it that I really like?
Yeah.
And rephrase it to say, what is it that I really love?
Yeah. Or what is it that I come alive to?
Yeah.
Come alive in the presence of? What is it that turns this is a question we often sit with around the table at the school is how do you turn the gift you're carrying into something you're capable of giving in a way that will be received as a gift. Because
Mm.
for many of us, I think it can be a long journey in life from the point of knowing that you've got something. There is something that's yours to do. There is something that you're carrying that you have a responsibility for. But actually, it's kind of tragic. You see people who are trying to offer the thing that they're carrying as a gift in a way that is just a source of irritation,
Mm.
in a way that they haven't found the knack of turning it into a gift. And that's part of what I see. It's part of what somebody like Martin has been trying to teach people all down the years through his school. It's part of what I hope we're doing with, yeah, with these conversations, with the work that Anna and I are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I also have to out myself at the conclusion here that I am a hopeless romantic. So if it's perturbed you to have been working with a hopeless romantic all these years, I've obviously hidden it very well.
Oh, well, you and Paul Kingsnorth both. I
Yeah.
think part of the kind of the energy field of Dark Mountain in its early years had a lot to do with the fact that Paul would gladly have defined himself and the project as romantic, and I was quite resistant to that for reasons I wrote about in my essay for Romanticon.
Mm.
But I think there can be a healthy energy that comes from those kind of different affinities in an ongoing collaboration.
Yeah. So should we finish on a poem for a
Let's
romantic
finish
note?
on a poem. Yeah.
Yeah. Indulge me this much. So this is, I think it builds on actually what we've just been saying, but it's The Point by Kay Tempest. The days, they break to fade. What fills them I'll forget. Every touch and smell and taste, this sun about to set, can never last. It breaks my heart. Each joy feels like a threat. Although there's beauty everywhere, its shadow is regret. Still, something in the coming dusk whispers not to fret. Don't matter that we'll lose today. It's not tomorrow yet.
Thanks for listening to the Great Humbling podcast. You can find more at our website, homewardbound.org, where you can also subscribe to us on Substack. We're on Facebook as The Great Humbling. Ed is, I believe, still on the site formerly known as Twitter as @FruCool. And if you'd like to spend more time with my work, then visit aschoolcalledhome.org and find out about the online series that we're hosting there. The title music for the podcast comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again for listening.